like to welcome you all to the first ASPG meeting for 2024. And I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people here today. There's one little small housekeeping matter. There's a sign-in form just outside the door. Would everybody make sure that they sign in, please? You can do it after, but if you would just kindly sign in. We are very fortunate indeed today to be benefiting from the considerable expertise of Professor Chris Marsden. Professor Marsden is the Professor of Artificial Intelligence, Technology and the Law, and Director of the new Digital Law Group at Monash University. He is also Associate Director for Global Governance of the Data Future Institute. So we really do have an expert with us today. Professor Marsden's work focuses on how we are all regulated by codes and how the intersection of our legal and social codes and computer codes affect us and how those codes interact with each other. Chris has authored or been the lead author on 5 monographs, and he has considerable journal articles, book chapters, and makes contributions in other ways to the discipline. His work actually analyses the disruption we can expect emerging technologies to have on existing structures.
Good. We had a chance to reframe, so that was a good thing. So thank you for the invitation and for the introduction, and thank you obviously to the division bell as well for reminding us which building we're in. So I'm going to talk a little bit about disinformation and AI. It's going to be a slightly speculative talk, and I'll frame it a little bit in terms of not just the effects that technology will have on us, but the effects of the technology companies on some of the wider problems that we might face. So, a reminder of what Monash does. Monash was, of course, set up partly with a view to the urgent need for the establishment of courses in applied science and technology. So we're still doing that. And I actually put up this slide in part because of the fact that it's the 60th year of Monash Law School this year. We had a gala to celebrate a couple of weeks ago. Amongst others, Professor Louis Waller, very active in technology and the law, albeit not in IT. And so I'm conscious that I'm very much standing on the shoulders of, certainly in that case, a giant in the field. So my background is I've been working in tech policy for about 30 years. And as you can see, and as you can hear, I'm a POM. I've been over here for a couple of years. Although my first visit was in '91, as I remind my students, as they look at each other and realize that that's long before they were born. And my first time as a research fellow in Melbourne was actually in '99. Again, for some of my students, terrifyingly, that is again before they were born. And I've been working on internet law and platform liability issues for all of that time. If we go back 30 years, we're talking about the liberalization of telecommunications. So I do like to get in the weeds of regulation, and you'll see that to some extent as we go through. Typically also, it's worth saying, I work with computer scientists, to some extent translating for them into the law, but also translating the law to them. And that's important to mention because a lot of the debate that's taken place around some of the specifics of AI policy has been led by the computer scientists who haven't necessarily ever dealt with regulatory and legislative policy. And that means they make some assumptions which I think the people in this room would not make. Like we should have a United Nations agency for AI. Well, you know, there's a job for life, but I don't think it's going to solve many of our constituents' immediate problems. So I just want to point that out. I'm a lawyer, I work with computer scientists and indeed political scientists in order to come up with a rounded view. So I know enough about technology to be dangerous, but I'm not one of those lawyers who claims to know everything because they can't possibly, because they're lawyers by background, not computer scientists. Okay, so I'm going to focus on speculative AI as opposed to some of the more straightforward issues. I want to say a couple of things about algorithmic regulation and the current legal changes that are taking place, but then I'll devote the rest of the talk to talking about things that are a little bit more longer term, because I understood that was the brief that would be useful. So I'm not going to talk too much about the Robodebt Royal Commission or about the current federal parliament's attempts to reform privacy. We have a new privacy commissioner arriving imminently in the country, first privacy commissioner obviously at federal level for many years. And I'm going to do a little bit of deflating of the AI hype, which I hope is going to be helpful for people. So if you take nothing else away from the talk, you'll get an idea of some of the things not to worry about, and hopefully some things to really worry about. And this is a little introduction and health warning I give to my students, but I think it's always useful to give it to any audience. We're going to be talking about things that need frank discussion and where we may have disagreements, and we should feel free to have those debates. I'm conscious we're being filmed, so there's no point in me saying we'll take all of this off the record afterwards, but nevertheless we may edit down some of the video or indeed leave it for posterity. So that's really important. So a couple of current issues. Public sector decision making, of course, already uses considerations of AI in, amongst other things, procurement. And here's some work by some colleagues of mine, Ye-Fui and Eric, doing some work on procurement issues in, for instance, construction. There's a lot of really active discussion taking place there. It's also worth saying that we also need to be aware of some of the problems that arise about accountability right through, I mentioned Robodebt, right through the issues that we deal with in algorithmic decision making, which affects us in so many different ways. If you apply for a loan, if you want insurance, you've been dealing with algorithms for many, many years. Indeed, I couldn't find my way here today without algorithmic decision making, because I certainly didn't make my own decisions about how I got here. I used my smartphone. I also want to make note of the Productivity Commission, which has produced some really interesting recent research on the impact of AI and indeed how we might regulate AI. So the weeds of those discussions are things that I'll refer to here. I also want to note that all these discussions about algorithms and AI come within a wider field, which is what we do when we use the internet, and that includes, of course, considerations of cybersecurity. I don't need to remind people in this building that when we decamped in 2020, we basically moved into a world of extreme decentralization of cybersecurity, should we say. So we live in a world where we have very, very significant cybersecurity challenges. I'll kind of take it as read that there's a huge issue there, which AI will not necessarily make any easier. Okay. There's always a slide which says, isn't the world very confusing and complicated? And this is the slide that says, isn't the world very confusing and complicated? But the point about, I think, this slide is that this is all data which is generated before the impact, at least, of generative AI. So we need to be aware that we're already dealing with massive information overload. And I'm sure that everyone dealing with consultation processes for new policy is very aware that you are now receiving increasing volumes of consultation responses, but not necessarily increasing volumes of consultation wisdom in those responses. So we know that we're already dealing in a world where constituents feel very able to reach out to parliamentarians via all kinds of social media for all kinds of reasons. The letter is no longer the primary means of communication. Okay. It's worth also saying artificial intelligence is not new, and nor is the hype around artificial intelligence. At the top are and of course it was always the fathers in 1956 allegedly, the founders of AI. AI was supposed to have been solved in a summer school in the middle of 1956 at Dartmouth in the United States. Needless to say, that didn't happen, but people like Claude Shannon and Marvin Minsky were very much at the beginning of that. Some of those actually still with us. Whereas Meredith Whittaker, who is the head of policy for Signal, for those of you who don't use Signal, it's the less crackable alternative to WhatsApp. You really should be using Signal. I'm not quite sure what the advice is inside this building, but it's a much more secure protocol. It says AI is a marketing term, not a technical term, and artificial general intelligence, AGI, is a marketing term overlaid with quasi-religious connotations. So let's be a little cynical about what AI really is. Computer scientists tend to talk a lot more about machine learning. There always has to be a meme in these talks. Rather famous meme involving, amongst others, Bill Murray, where you can see that people talk about GPT-4 these days. This is, by the way, from 2021, so it was predicting the rise of GPT-4 and therefore ChatGPT. Whereas, in fact, most computer scientists are more concerned when they talk about machine learning with much more, you might say, prosaic applications, including, of course, online search, which is probably still the predominant means of using AI. And in fact, I don't know how many actual trained lawyers there are in the room, but trained lawyers will tend to admit that the main reason that they use AI is because they're doing a Google search for cases, rather than using ChatGPT for the new thing. Okay. It's also worth noting that the originators of AI did not expect AI to produce creative solutions to problems. So the father of neural networks, Warren McCullough, said that he didn't think that computers would say anything new or creative or interesting, and that they can only corrupt revelation. There's a wonderful term to use for a computer scientist. So we should be aware that I'm sure you're all aware, ChatGPT produces what are called hallucinations, otherwise known as lies. And it's not unexpected that neural networks would produce those kind of mashups of fact and fiction. It's also worth saying, of course, consumer tech law is not new either. On the left, as you're looking at it, is a wonderful advert for cough syrup from the late 19th century. I'm told that this would have worked, or be it you wouldn't have even known you had a cough by the time you'd taken this stuff. On the left is the advice that I received when I looked for my, given the heat of today, an air conditioning unit. You had to download the handbook, or manual, although it wasn't really a manual, it was 16 pages, and it basically said anything that you use too much can be injurious. I wasn't sure whether it was actually being sarcastic or ironic, but nevertheless, that was the advice it gave. We've dealt with consumer tech law for a very long time. AI is, of course, affecting other fields. In about a month's time, have to travel on an Alaska Airlines 737 MAX. And you may remember the recent news story where the 737 MAX developed indoor and outdoor seating when the door blew off. Well, of course, that was a problem that was caused by actually the nuts and bolts just not being fitted properly. But it's worth remembering that the previous debate that we had about the 737 MAX was the fact that it was a fly-by-wire AI-aided system, and there was a software update that was needed in order to land it safely. So you remember a couple of years ago that debate. The other thing to say about some of the issues that technology are bringing into this discussion, very, very big scandal involving Toyota just before Christmas. Toyota was effectively cheating the testing. This was actually a debate that you remember Volkswagen had this problem about 8 years ago. Of course, this was the use of IT in order to effectively tell the engine management system to avoid the test, or to, how should we put it, pass the test. I'm trying to think of the terms that my students would put for accidentally using IT or AI. So we're concerned about AI for these reasons, which are that the development of computer technology has enabled us to effectively be pretty good at things like reading comprehension using AI, language understanding, so machine translation is much better than it used to be. And all of these things are kind of happening at the same time, which is roughly in the period 2020, 2023. So we know that Moore's law and other advances have enabled us to reach this point. That's because of advances at all stages of the technology stack. Now, these are some of the generative AI companies you might have heard of. The next diagram is maybe more useful to remind you that when we're looking at these things, and my students constantly remind me, people who did well out of gold rushes were the people selling the spades and the buckets. Let's remember that AI is built on a whole range of technologies, including particularly cloud computing because of the storage needs of AI, the basic computing needs, where NVIDIA has become a new trillion-dollar company. So let's be aware of this being built on a whole stack of technologies. And this becomes important when we think about the power of the companies that are involved. Okay. We also need to be very aware of the hype around companies self-regulating when it comes to artificial intelligence. So AI ethics frameworks, papers, discussions, some of you may have had these inflicted on you, very, very numerous. There are many hundreds now of these AI ethics papers that tell companies how they could self-regulate. I'm not saying that there are no examples of AI ethics in practice, but there are rather less than there are the discussion papers, let's put it that way. I also want to refer you to the UK. Actually, this is very dangerous. When a government refers to a pro-innovation approach to regulation, you know, of course, they're talking about self-regulation. The UK, you shouldn't take too seriously what the United Kingdom says about AI regulation, simply because, I'm sure you're aware, the UK is in the dying stages of its current parliament. Nothing could be done even if they wanted to. So when people say pro-innovation, they mean, of course, stick to self-regulation. Okay. Maybe the most extreme example of that is the chief executive of OpenAI, which is the, I suppose, the leading not-for-profit AI company, has very recently made the rather attention-grabbing claim that he wants $7 trillion US dollars, roughly 11 trillion Australian dollars, in order to build the environment that will allow us to have artificial general intelligence. Which is impressive. It sounds like a preposterous amount of money until you start adding up the value of the companies that would be involved in this. So we're talking about, I mentioned NVIDIA, Microsoft, which is the chief investor in OpenAI, Meta, which is Facebook, Amazon, which is the largest cloud computing infrastructure, as well as obviously the seller of originally books and other things. Add those companies together, it actually comes quite close to that amount. So he's not making such a preposterous claim. On the other hand, people who work in the IT industry are always very keen to they're always very keen to tell people about the basic lesson of cybersecurity and the biggest flaw in cybersecurity systems, which is apparently a large hammer. And I'm told that the reason why that's the biggest flaw in cybersecurity systems is that you find the person who's the systems administrator and you threaten to hit them with a large hammer unless they give you the password. So that's how secure our systems are, sadly. Hopefully a little bit more so. People have talked about the danger of AI hype for a long time. And I want us all to think about the various different types of hypes that we've had before. I lived through a lot of the early internet hype, the dot-com hype as it was called in the late 1990s, the blockchain hype, which happened in about the mid-2010s, Web 2.0, if people remember, that was about 2005, 2006, 2007. NFTs, which appear to have disappeared off everyone's radar more recently. If you do have an NFT, do keep it as a historical artifact. And of course, Bitcoin, which continually comes back in terms of the hype that results from that. And Richard Jones analysed these things and talks about the kind of buzzwords that come up. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that AI is not going to become a permanent feature of the landscape. I just want to point out we've been talking about AI for well over 60 years. We will talk about it for another 60 years. Be aware that the hype around ChatGPT at the moment may be short-lived, even if the technology itself is a longer-lived contributor. Okay, so let's quickly talk about disinformation. The very arresting image there is Nina Schick, who wrote a book called Deepfakes and the Infopocalypse. Second part is an interesting term to use. And I'm going to talk just very, very quickly about election disinformation, but I'm not going to give you a very deep dive into this. Some of the problems that we're dealing with come from speech-to-text, so chatbots being used in order to assist with elections. I should say, I always keep Clippy on the slide so we can remember that we've talked for a long time about chatbots. And also, of course, we talked for a long time about Wikipedia as well, which is 24 years old this year. But some of the home truths about tech disinformation I think are really important to look at. Kate Dommett, who's one of the leading researchers in the field, and she advised, amongst others, UK parliamentary committees, talks about the fact that when we worry about disinformation, we may be worried about the wrong thing. And we may think this is reassuring or insulting, talks about the fact that political parties tend not to be very advanced or technologically aware users of information. They simply want lists of voters to attract voters. and that people look at very sophisticated operations in the United States and assume that every political party in the world is somehow using very advanced forms of technology in order to perform disinformation. And that simply isn't the case from the research that she's done across countries. So we should be aware of that, that the possibilities of technology are not the same as the actual uses of technology, particularly by political parties. There may be other actors who are more sophisticated and indeed are very willing to sell their wares to political parties, but we can overstate the influence of disinformation. And AI, of course, allows, amongst other things, deep fakes, and that's interesting. So recently, a deep fake audio of the voice of Joe Biden was used in an unauthorized way. Video fakes being used, but as we'll see when we see the recording of this talk, editing can produce all kinds of unusual misunderstandings. And we know that there's a history of Meta and Facebook allowing disinformation to flourish. And it's worth reminding ourselves that, of course, the Meta properties, WhatsApp and Facebook, have approximately 30 times as large an audience as X, what we used to call Twitter. And so we tend to be, particularly I think in the political space, we fixate a little bit on Twitter or X because we can take the temperature of those who appear to be, we can call them politically committed, let's just say committed, one way or another, whereas actually most of the discussion that affects voters is happening in fora that we understand a lot less because they're semi-private and semi-public. It's also worth saying that, of course, Meta is searching for its place in AI, and I might get a chance to talk about that a bit more. But I think there's a much, much bigger disinformation. So I don't want to say disinformation is a small problem, but I want to say that I think the problem is much larger than just an issue about our political parties using data in good or bad ways. And it's this, it's what being called by Anna Lemke, amongst others, the dopamine effect and how it's affecting our consumption of information. And it's really been a fascinating effect to see. People's use of smartphones is changing their consumption of information in radical ways. And we're all aware of, hopefully everyone in this room switches off notifications as much as possible on their phone because they are more distracting even than a division bell. And so we're all very aware of this kind of dopamine loop effect that can happen. I think it's a particular problem possibly for people at the beginning of their political careers. Are you looking for as much engagement as possible? I suspect most people in this building have seen too much connection to their constituents on an instant basis. You tend to hear the loudest voices rather than the most voices. But what actually happens if you're not self-regulating your use of a smartphone is that you move from information and entertainment towards distraction, towards addiction. And there is, of course, an addiction problem with the use of social media, which is a really major issue. And this instant gratification is not just taking over, to some extent, politics, for those who are not self-regulating what they're doing, but lots of other areas as well. And this graphic illustrates from athletics to journalism, to music, to images, even to relationships. I'm not going to give away the age of the audience because we're being filmed, but some of us may be thanking our lucky stars that we form relationships in a pre-social media age, as opposed to being in this world where swiping on an app is the recognition of our attractiveness or otherwise. And so one of the effects of that dopamine hit effect is, of course, the dumbing down of campaigns. And that's a really serious issue. And I should say, this is not just, of course, something that affects politics. It even, I hate to say it, affects law schools and education. So this is a US Law Dean survey of where it is that we're focused. There's a real problem about whether or not we're expected to be producing TED Talks. And I think that a lot of politicians are very concerned about the need to produce sound bites when they would like to be more engaged in wider policy discussions. So this is disinformation as a tool of simplifying or oversimplifying political discussion more broadly. This is a rather wider debate than simply political party disinformation. Quick couple of adverts from my own research in this area. That's myself with Tricia Meyer. Tricia's a political scientist. We also work with Ian Brown, a computer scientist, producing work for the European Parliament. This was prior to the 2019 European Parliament elections. Elections, obviously, that affect 500, or in which 400 million people can vote. The European Parliament only becomes engaged in elections at these 5-yearly intervals. So national elections are entirely a matter for the individual member states, but European parliamentary elections, of course, allow discussion to be had. And in the European parliamentary election process, they drove a code of conduct, a code of practice between the giant platforms, so Meta and Twitter as it was, and so on, and Google, and the European Commission. So they achieved something because of their size. We produced this report for the European Parliament. There were rather less people involved in it, partly because it was the day after a terrorist attack. So we had, I think, 5 people in the room, but nevertheless, it was filmed. And we talked about the what you may well know as the co-regulatory or the regulatory triangle, the fact that the way in which we drive regulation of large technology companies with very rapid changes in technology and indeed audience is by thinking about standards and by thinking about the relationship between self-regulation and government. That you don't just try to impose a law from the top, because that in itself could have very perverse effects. You try to work with the companies on an understanding that there is the stick of regulation alongside the carrot of self-regulation and standards. And so I will always preach about co-regulation in the European Union, or at least at the European Commission level. I'm preaching to the choir. I'm aware lots of people talk about the need for allowing as much self-regulation as possible, and hopefully we'll get into this discussion in Q&A. Okay, in 2018, by the way, we said that there were basically 5 ways that you could regulate disinformation. The first one, media literacy and user choice. That's the easy one, of course, but of course, you do have to ask how long it takes for that to take effect. And when we talk about media literacy and consumer choice, Finland, where it's a compulsory subject at school, will tell you it takes about 20 years for that to take effect. So we're talking about 2044. If we were to start now, making it mandatory across schools, for instance. So, something to think about. A few other areas as well. I've been given a 3-minute warning, so I just want to move on a little bit, to say that we also produce a report on disinformation for the, not for the Commonwealth of Australia, but for the Commonwealth of, we're not allowed to call it the Commonwealth of Nations. It's only allowed to be called the Commonwealth. Anyway, the 54 Commonwealth countries. And the Australian Electoral Commissioner at federal level was involved in this discussion and indeed this study. We actually had a really fascinating 18 months or so project we engaged in with the India, the Pakistan electoral commissioners were involved, as well as small Pacific Island states and small Caribbean island states. And what was fascinating was, of course, the fact that when you're talking about trying to regulate what platforms do about disinformation, if you're the government of India, you can tell the platforms what they will do. If you're Kiribati, you're in a very different situation, or Antigua for that matter. So really fascinating to see how much you can actually engage in a discussion about helping small island states and other microstates to deal with platforms where they obviously can't do that themselves. So we produced that report, and this went on into a book called Big Tech, Regulating Big Tech, and maybe I'll leave this up at the end because we can come back to this discussion. Okay, so big issues arise about AI's effect on society more generally. This is, of course, Klimt Eastwood. Some of you might be familiar with this graphic. And one thing I just want to maybe end with is be aware that the big companies working in AI are not just Silicon Valley, expression uses, tech bros, but they're tech bros who are really convinced that AI will change the world and are devoted to looking at that. So, you know, very much, I'm not saying whether the book is good or bad, but very much readers of Atlas Shrugged, a very successful Russian-American author in her own time, or rather after her own time, now I come to think of it. I think Ayn Rand actually was much more read since passing on than before that. But they're really, really extreme libertarians. And it's a really important thing to mention. And the reason why that becomes extremely important, I think, for parliamentarians to bear in mind, is that, of course, a lot of these people have a huge amount of resources to lobby Parliament if they wish. And that maybe leads me on to my last slide, which is, you may remember there was a big panic that happened in the middle and towards the end of last year about artificial general intelligence and the risk that we were allowing ourselves to be essentially taken over by artificial intelligence in the very near future. And this was a risk that was actually pushed by the companies themselves, and it produced, amongst other things, what actually turned out to be a very useful AI Safety Summit, which was at Bletchley Park in the UK, and the Bletchley Declaration was signed up to by the federal government here, amongst others, and 50 other countries. And it's really, really important to be aware of this. So there is this debate about whether AI will take over. At this point, you insert your favorite sci-fi film. Most people choose Terminator, but people choose other things as well. Transcendence, for those of you who know that movie, which you may remember Elon Musk appeared in towards the beginning. And so there is this wider risk about artificial general intelligence, but that can obscure the real problems we have short-term about algorithms and the robo-debt scandal and other things, but also medium-term about the use of artificial intelligence there. So, takeaway message, regulation is inevitable eventually of artificial intelligence. This is some cheat sheets on the European position, which I'm happy to share with people because, as you can see, I've cribbed them from people from LinkedIn. We don't yet have even a European Artificial Intelligence Act. And I hate to tell you this, but it's a strange term because the European Union doesn't have acts or bills. So it will actually be called the Artificial Intelligence Regulation when it is finally voted in May of this year. But we will have this soon. It's worth saying that will not take effect for most of its powers for at least 2 years, for many of the others 3 years. So this Artificial Intelligence Act, which you've heard too much about for 2 years, I'm sure, won't take effect for another 3 years. Short term, what we'll be looking at is privacy regulation, and specifically the GDPR. So this will happen. I think that from the point of view of Victoria and from the point of view of the federal government, it's not something that people need to panic about yet, because it won't be enforced for several years, but we will see this becoming important. And if I am going to finish, maybe I won't do the copyright slide, maybe I'll just go back to the slide that I mentioned of details that we may or may not get to talk about in Q&A. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, I need it down. Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris. I'm sure there are going to be... What's wrong? Well, I'll talk louder. I think there's going to be a lot of questions, so I'm going to ask people to just make sure they have one question to start with, no sort of add-ons, and please not a lot of commentary, and if then we find we've run out of questions to be asked, and I can go back to people who may like to ask a supplementary. But I think there'll be a lot of very interesting questions. I had a few myself, but in respect for the time and the ringing of the bells, I'll forego mine and ask Chris privately later. But who would like to start with people with questions? Yeah. Do I? Yes, is there a computer? Is there any questions from
I think we need to capture things on mic for the recording.
Is there anybody from technology here?
Anyone who knows... Oh, I must have hit the on button. I was looking for it. I'm interested in your discussion about the regulability of AI. And I think from the reading I've done in the area, there are two very good reasons why it is pretty unregulable, and they are to do with the incentives for the people who are either being regulated or in charge of regulation. For the really big tech companies, the race to AGI, artificial general intelligence, is the race to the gigantic gold mine. Good, it's a short one. There's a whole sort of raft of discussion about not suppressing innovation, and that's driven by the fact that they want to be able to compete with each other like mad to win the AGI race. And so that's why you get really soft stuff like when they're all called into Biden's office and Biden reckons let's go with self-regulation. The second one is the incentive of governments themselves who are engaged in a quasi-digital arms race with, China and other countries we could mention for ownership of the AI space in general. Neither of those groups have any incentive to be regulated at all, and I'd just be interested in your commentary about, is it possible to change incentives so that there is some reason to become regulated?
Really good questions. And I will say, so the answer to the first question is that, as with privacy law more generally, you end up hoping for the good graces of the Irish regulator. So there is a lot of, I think, deliberately misinformed commentary about how strict European law is on privacy, for instance, which will, of course, affect, amongst others, the AI industry. And essentially, there's a lot of talk and very little enforcement, and that's because the enforcement takes place in Dublin. And the government and the regulator don't have strong incentives, as you said, to regulate. So I don't really expect, laws that are being put in place in Europe, for instance, to be very strongly enforced in the short term. Is there an incentive to become regulated? I think yes, because there's an incentive to appear to be acting responsibly. So companies have been very keen to sign up to AI ethics self-regulation up to now. Large companies, I'm talking about the trillion-dollar companies. So you will expect that to happen. And again, you would expect very small companies to be much less incentivized. Unfortunately, depressingly, in the internet space, so I talked about the lessons we take from internet policy, it's turned out that the best way to actually ensure most people were consuming data that appeared to be regulated was encouraging the big companies to take over the small ones. So removing the free rider problem by actually creating a monopoly problem. And I don't see that not happening this time. I'm quite cynical about the expectation that we have more than hype around, we need to put an AI Act in place. It's a bit like saying we need a Privacy Act. It's like, yes, we want the Act, but we don't want strict enforcement. Is it St. Augustine? Give me, well, I won't even repeat the phrase. Anyway, the idea that you would like a theoretical devotion to a particular act. On the second question, I think that there will be incentives in place to differentiate companies from some of the regulatory regimes that we wouldn't want to follow. So we don't want to follow, I don't think at least, the approach that's been followed in China, for instance. And I think that comparisons of China with the United States or with Australia or with the European Union are ill-advised when we are dealing, after all, with the dissemination of information. And I think the idea that we're somehow in a race where we're trying to copy China seems to me a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding of China on two levels. First of all, not a political system that we would find very attractive. But secondly, there's an impression of the efficiency of the Chinese government, which anybody associated with the Chinese government would not agree with. And when you talk to China scholars about the degree to which, for instance, the government collects data on, amongst other things, the social credit scheme, they will say, oh yeah, no, this is nothing like as efficient as what Google or Meta does. We stand in awe of the ability of American private industry to gather data. It's nothing that the Chinese government could ever approach. So you may or may not believe that, but there are comparisons we wouldn't want to make. And I think that companies will want the badge of legitimacy, which, I mean, they'll follow this. They will go to the European space and they will say, we want to advertise to potential customers that we are fully compliant with the European AI Act. And they will see that as being something which will be a kind of a really useful marketing exercise for Australian customers as well, to be able to say, hey, look, we're conforming. Whether they have to conform in practice, may or may not follow. I don't know if that answers the question. I hope it answers it.
Is there anybody else with a question? Jim, please.
Thanks, Colin. So in human biology, there there have been regulations about areas that you can't research, such as stem cell research.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think it's still working, it's just gone quieter.
thank you. Or you're cloning humans, that kind of stuff. Is there any discussion about regulating research in AI rather than practice of AI?
Yes, there is. And one of the reasons, of course, why people tend to forget, why OpenAI was founded by Elon Musk and Sam Altman and others was about ensuring the safe development of AI. But there hasn't been a huge amount of discussion. I showed you, I think, a quotation from the chief executive of Palantir saying, well, of course, we weren't planning on using AI in warfare, but we've decided now that it's too much of an existential benefit to one side for us not to use this thing, and so we're going to. So yes, there were attempts to ban the use of AI in that type of application, but whether that happens in practice or not, I don't know. I pointed out the work of Louis Waller, which of course was around the use of biotech in IVF. On that slide, I also talked about the fact, I hadn't known this, that Victoria was apparently the first parliament in the world to pass mandatory seatbelt legislation, which is, depending on your point of view, I think a feather in the cap for everyone except car windscreen manufacturers, I guess. But I think that the idea that we will be able to ban the way in which this research is carried out, I think is probably, A, I think we've missed the boat, and B, I think a lot of researchers will choose to research in countries that don't have those bans in place. So a lot of AI research takes place in the Gulf, a lot of AI research obviously takes place in China, and researchers are obviously very mobile, at least at individual level, if not group level. So, are we going to be able to have some kind of, partial research ban policy in place? I don't think so. But I think it still remains open for Australian research institutes to decide that there are things that they don't wish to research. And I think that the need for ethical research is really strong. And I think also you'll get, hopefully, better researchers working in a more ethical environment, although the empirical research on that is not always encouraging. Do you want to get the mic? Because I think just for the recording.
I'm attached to this mic.
You credit me with having a very loud voice, so glad to have this assistance. Thank you very much for the very fascinating thing, and also for the other questioners who've asked questions I was trying to struggle with. At the very beginning, you said that some of your colleagues have unrealistic views about the role of the UN in this. Now, I'm not somebody who believes that any level of government has got all the answers, but I tend to view that the answers are best structured and best monitored, perfected if you have various levels of governance involved in it. I'm just wondering, things that what you would see as the opportunities for international, especially UN-sponsored thought, action, or one of the great things, of course, about the UN is it's very good for norm development, if not actually always norm implementation.
That's a really good question. And so I think that my cynicism was about the fact that a lot of politicians they'd watched Oppenheimer and decided that it was time for a recreation of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And that seemed to be before the Bletchley Declaration, that seemed to be a very strong opinion that people had. Not knowing, of course, how long it had taken the International Atomic Energy Authority to be set up, and also the problem, which is that it's both a promoter and a regulator of both nuclear arms and nuclear power. It's honestly the worst possible example, I think, of a UN agency to regulate. However, I think there's three bits which are really useful. The first is there needs to be a discussion, a forum at international level where best practice can be shared. Whether that means that the United Nations Internet Governance Forum becomes devoted to AI as well, or whether something new along those lines needs setting up. Clearly that would be very useful. UNESCO has been doing a lot of work in this field. I've actually been invited to to speak at a UNESCO meeting, which is 1 o'clock Paris time tonight. So whether I make it or not, I'm not sure. Second thing I think on that is that Australia is involved in the negotiation of the Council of Europe Framework Convention on AI right now. And so, you know, we may be signatories to a convention in the field. Now, that will be a much stripped-back version of, not even a version, a much stripped-back alternative to the European AI Act. But it could be very powerful. And we've got a really good example of previous work. For those who don't know, the Council of Europe is 46 official members in the European Union, in the European space. It's everywhere in Europe except Russia, basically. Russia was expelled but left at the same time, so we're still not quite sure whether the Russians deliberately, whether they left or whether they were expelled, but that was 2 years ago. So it's much bigger than the European Union. And with the two previous examples of that working really well are the Budapest Cybercrime Convention of 2001, which has been signed up to by 70 or so countries, well outside Europe. And also the Council of Europe's Convention 108, 108 Plus, on data protection and privacy. Both of which have formed models that actually Australia has found really useful to not exactly copy, but to adapt. So absolutely there's a space for an international discussion of that kind. I guess you'd call that a plurilateral rather than a multinational organization, because it's a group of countries. And then I think the third thing is pooling of international research. And this is something which is, I don't just mean research into AI itself, but policy research as well. And there's been a huge amount of work done amongst others in the OECD on this. And so there's obviously space for that to happen. So absolutely agree, international roles, United Nations level, even if it's a discussion or a policy discussion level, much more technical discussions as well, and it doesn't just have to be OECD, I know there are others. And then examples of conventions which can form a model for individual states to adopt as their own laws. I should say this Council of Europe Convention's looking a bit shaky at the moment from those who are leaking the internal discussions. It looks like it's going to be so weak that almost any state could sign up to it, but why would you bother? So we'll just see what the outcome is of that.
Hi. I'm with the Hansard unit, and I guess I've been thinking a lot about whether it's Hansard or the DSM or legislation websites. There are sources of information that are supposed to be objective reality and are also far more complex and long, and people don't want to read them. They want to read a summary or they want to read an extract, and it's one of the main uses of AI is to do just that. But any act of summarizing means it's not as nuanced or is oversimplified or not true. Just strategically, would you say it's better to try to hide information like that that's too complex to be summarized, or is it better for bodies like that to build their own tools for accessing this information so that they can actually put some rules, put some guidance around it?
So it's a really good question, and this is something that we wrestle with at Monash because of the fact that our students are using AI for their essays, even if they're told that they can't. Particularly actually international students who find it really useful for language, but also students who are trying to simplify very, very complex legislation. My colleague Melissa Caston keeps talking about a case called the Tasmanian Dams, which I believe is a legendary example of enormous cases that people used to just read and summarize. So I think there's a couple of really important issues there. The first is that if you want absolute accuracy, you can't replace the human role, obviously, in analysis. And this is why I think a lot of people in the law profession are going to be somewhat protected from the effects of at least generic AI being used. And then you could say, well, it would be great to have an AI which is trained entirely on parliamentary information, and so therefore isn't polluted by, web-based garbage which could affect its ability to summarize. And that would be great. So if you could actually, train an LLM model entirely on Hansard, that would enable it to be accurate and not introduce some of these problems which, as I always remind my students, people actually do lie on the internet. But then who's going to fund it? And this is always the problem, that we say, oh, well, and I'm very, very conscious of, I've talked a lot to amongst other court reporters and others about the way that AI could make their job better. And it always comes down to, but our funding is continually being cut. And so we can't do this on top of the other things unless, I hope that we live in a world where we have particularly benign parliaments that acknowledge the fact that you need to actually give a little more funding if you want to use these new tools. But I'm conscious that I don't want to be, and I should say, he's much more complex than this. But Richard Susskind says this will revolutionize the way we use legal information, et cetera, and he's always conscious of the fact that he always adds this point that people forget, which is, but we'll need more money to do it. And people always forget that bit, that he always does say, but we'll need more money to do it. And yeah, of course, it would be great if we could come up with an accurate form of AI to summarize. I'm sure it would be enormously useful for parliamentarians. A slide I never got to was what do you do when you get 1 million responses to a consultation? Of course, you need to use AI to work out which one of those responses is actually useful and which ones are simply generic. And I worked in a field, a very complex policy field, called network neutrality, which is about the neutrality of the internet, where there was a US consultation on this, which produced 18 million replies. Now, this is 10 years ago, so what happened is the regulatory agency just discarded that consultation, they just was scrapping the consultation. But of course, if they could have used AI to find out which were the 17 of the 18 million, 17, not 17 million, but 17 unique consultation responses, they could have winnowed it down. And that's the kind of problem we're going to get, where we get this vast number of responses to a consultation, and you actually only want the unique ones. You don't need the 28 million copies. So that's going to be a real challenge. Maybe that's an area where parliaments actually do need to very definitively devote resources to being able to actually work through consultation responses in a way that makes it possible to identify the unique ones.
Yes, this gentleman has one.
Thank you, Chris. A question, one of the, AI almost always, perhaps always, relies on the pre-existence of lots of data to be trained, ingesting the data, analysing it, etc., including artworks, etc. Now, intellectual property is an area that does actually have some level of effect internationally in terms of enforcement mechanisms and so on. And we're starting to see some developments in that space of attempts to use intellectual property laws to either slow down or seek recompense for the use of pre-existing works in the development of AI. Do you see that as having, in the big picture, any kind of real effect on the development of AI, or do you think will the AI juggernaut just keep on hurtling down and that will be a little footnote historically?
So I do have a slide about that, which I won't show you. And just to say, of course, Rebecca Giblin at the University of Melbourne is much more expert than me in this field. But I think there's three things. The first is that only the big companies producing proprietary information are going to be able to sue. And you'd like to think that collecting societies will be able to distribute monies equally from these AI companies in terms of their use, I think pretty widely acknowledged use of copyrighted material without permission. That would be lovely. But I think what will happen is that the big publishing houses will make some money from the AI companies, and that the smaller ones will not, unfortunately, be able to do so. It's to some extent the kind of Spotify problem, which is the larger you are, the better able you are to negotiate terms. The second thing is, absolutely, all of these models are trained on vast amounts of data, and it's becoming clearer and clearer how much inaccurate data is being used, which is why I said that obviously training any AI on wider web data is going to make it inaccurate. So unfortunately you can't trust any AI that's been trained on that data because of the amount of inaccuracy on the web. So yes, I would hope that I'm not going to say I would hope for a rational outcome from copyright law because I'm not that naive, but I would hope that we at least see some acknowledgement of creators' creators' effort in terms of the way that AI is using it. But rather like with the internet, in the internet space, we just saw all of this bolted on to the back of the pro-innovation policies that were adopted towards the internet. Even though I think I'm probably accurate in saying that almost the first US case that dealt with internet, with the internet use of data, was actually a case involving Playboy Enterprises suing a bulletin board in 1992. So they did quite well out of it for a little while. I think that we really are going to run into a problem of the failure to reward authors for this. I mean, the Klimt Eastwood piece that I showed you, I don't think Klimt made any money from it. I don't think the estate of Klimt has made any money out of it either. But it's that was a stable diffusion image, by the way. I mean, clearly they've been training their image generating software, obviously on copyrighted images.
We have one last question up the back.
There it is, and we can identify the images, can't we?
Yes. Thanks, Professor Marsden. I want to ask a cultural, political question. Are you comfortable with that?
You don't know my answer yet, so I'm comfortable with the question. Absolutely.
It's not exactly law related. So AI carries information, whether it is in a form of speech, a video, or a movie script. It has written. So they take information from sources around the world, English sources we use, and lots of these sources are based in the US. So it is safe to say that the hype of AI or the increased use of AI will help American culture to creep in even further, and in the process makes our people more susceptible to American political rhetorics.
I think that's been the march of culture for about 150 years, hasn't it? I suppose if we had perfect copyright enforcement, we'd force all AI to be trained on the great works of more than 100 years ago, but that's obviously not going to happen. Inevitably, I think, and this is a wider cultural, not just a copyright, but a wider cultural question about the development of soft power and the development of or the dissemination of culture. So I think, yes, that's clear. And if you've just seen the very recent launch of effectively the kind of, I'll call it a kind of video impression technology by OpenAI, which claims to create videos which are very close simulations of existing stock footage. Clearly that's trained on a lot of footage that already exists from Hollywood. I'm sure they're being sued as we speak for some of that footage. But yes, there'll be a concentration of power in the industry. And so I haven't thought very deeply about this. Perhaps you've thought about it a lot more than I have. But if there's a concentration of the economic actors that I was talking about in terms of cloud computing and GPUs and so on, then on a much broader level, there'll inevitably be a concentration of the cultural products as well. But I must admit, you're thinking about things in a much more long-term way than I am. And so that's a really fascinating question. Thank you.
Look, sadly, we're out of time. We'd like Chris to accept this very small gift with the appreciation of the ASPG for what was a truly enlightening and very informative talk, and the questions that were generated showed that. We really have gained from your knowledge. So would you all please join us in thanking Chris very much.